What's up, my wizards? It's Dev. Mtg, we like it in Magic, you know by now. And today, we are in the home stretch of Deck Tech season. We've only got like a week left before spoilers for War of the Spark start. And I've got like 10 decks I want to show you, but I've only got time for like 2 or 3 more. So I'm putting that responsibility off on my patrons as to what decks we're doing this week. The problem is, this last poll ended in a tie, between today's deck and Merfolk. So what we decided to do is we'll do Fish People a little bit later on this week. And today, we'll cover Blue-White Dovin Aggro, a deck I've been working on almost the entire season. That's right, when Dovin was like first spoiled, I tweeted out that I'd been working on a deck that was like a bunch of 1-drops and 4 Dovin and like 20 other cards. That's how I ended that tweet. And since then, I've been trying to determine what those other 20 cards are, and I think I'm finally ready to bring it to you. It all starts with 4 copies of the Big D, Dovin himself. This guy's name is only like 1 letter away from mine, so I personally identify with him. But he's also a pretty decent planeswalker, despite the relatively high amount of crap that he's taken since he was released. I think this is actually kind of the most playable planeswalker of the 3 that we got in Ravnica Allegiance. After a season of messing around with this thing, it turns out that first ability isn't too bad as long as you build your, more or less, your entire deck around it. Now, I've seen ideas for this deck where basically you curve Dovin on turn 3, into Karn on 4, into Tezzeret on 5, and it turns out that's actually one of the least successful ways you can play this deck. What you want to do is get on board as quickly as possible, sometimes playing a 1-drop on 1 and 2 1-drops on turn 2 to maximize the number of loyalty counters you can get out of Dovin starting on turn 3. You want to ultimate this as quickly as possible, but the middle ability is really nice too, almost no matter where you are in the game. Ahead, behind, it's always good to either make chump blockers and gain a little bit of extra life, help win that race against aggro decks, or just create more attackers to get in with. So again, the second ability is maybe the best ability on the entire card, and it's the one we probably are going to be using the most often. But if you can start really fast on board and go ahead and get 3 creatures down by turn 3 when you're going to play your Dovin, then suddenly you can get a lot of loyalty really fast and turn Dovin into your card draw engine, which is really nice for a deck like this that needs to replenish its hand starting on turn 4 or 5. Now, usually, you wouldn't want to judge a Planeswalker by its ultimate. That's mostly the case here, too, but again, if you make the deck build a concession of just playing tons and tons of 1-drops to make sure his +1 is as good as possible, then you're going to be a lot more likely to get to his ultimate really, really fast. And when you can do that, you can turn Dovin into the card advantage engine for the deck. Drawing 3 cards on turn 5 or 6 is really important for a deck like this. Those are the turns where you're going to really start needing more cards. Whether you're trying to overload the board and overwhelm your opponent, or you're just trying to get back on board after a sweeper. But now that we've talked a little bit about the DGA here, I think I've made it clear that what's most important is the team that you put around him. If we're going to get the most juice out of this Planeswalker, we have to play a bunch of 1-drops and get him on board as quickly as we can. So, with that in mind, we're playing 20 1-drops in this deck. We're a lot like the mono white deck that's going around in this format right now that plays so many 1-drops it wants to get on board and then anthem all of its guys really fast on turn 3. We're kind of taking a page out of that deck's book. We want to get on board quickly, but we mostly want to play flying and unblockable creatures if what we're trying to do is get power from Dovin. So with that said, let's look at our guys here in the 1-drop slot. We're going to start with the Marvel team, 4 copies of Hawkeye, 4 copies of the Millennium Falcon, and then 4 copies of Skymarcher Aspirant Man, which is actually, paradoxically, one of the biggest creatures in the deck at a whole 2 power. Now, it's actually not very hard to get the City's Blessing in this deck. If you can't tell, 21 drops makes that pretty easy. But so does Dovin, who can often put 2 permanents on the board the turn that he comes down. So City's Blessing will sometimes happen on turn 4, turn 5 at the latest a lot of the time in this deck, as long as you've been able to keep some pieces on the board. Now, Healer's Hawk is a great 1-drop too, shouldn't have to tell you that. This has lifelink, so it'll help you race against some of the heavier aggro decks in the format, including the dreaded mono-red aggro matchup. More on that later, so I know you're already telling me Goblin Chainwhirler exists. I agree, that's fine, but that's one of the reasons we have Rustwing Falcon in the deck. You know, when you compare it to Hawk, we lose a keyword ability, but we gain a point of toughness, and in a format with Goblin Chainwhirlers and Fanatical Firebrands, that point of toughness means an awful lot. But that's only a little more than half the story as far as 1-drops go. In the blue department, we're playing 4 copies of Storm, keeping up with the Marvel team, and 4 copies of Aquaman, I guess? MC Herald, for lack of a better term. The old MC is back, you know, in a deck that wants its creatures to go unblocked. This is more or less a dream pick that we kind of have to play. You know, the only thing better than flying in a deck that's trying to get its creatures through is obviously just total unblockability. So let's play 4 copies of the MC. But as far as Storm goes, this can obviously jump in front of important creatures and stuff, and there obviously aren't that many important targets to jump in front of in this deck, but if you ever absolutely need to, this can function as kind of a dive down for another guy, but for the most part, it's just a 1-mana 1/1 flyer. The best thing Storm does in this deck, actually, is counter Settle the Wreckage. Keep in mind it can do that, so we fear that card kind of an awful lot. Sometimes this will allow you to just push your entire team through and just dare your opponent to settle you because you have a 1-mana answer. Now, if that was a little fast, that was 20 total 1-drops. That's a lot, but we still have room for 10 2-drops in the deck. We'll top our curve out at 3 with Dovin and play 30 total creatures here. Again, if we're trying to get power out of Dovin, we got to play a bunch of creatures, but we're still afforded some 2-drops here. So let's run through these real quick, starting with the Double D. You guys know I like Departed Deckhand. You know, I'm a fan of the Boo Crew, and in a deck that's trying to, again, get through its creatures through unblocked, it's a great card. Like I've said it before, anything that's going to target this, like removal that's going to target this, is probably going to kill it anyway. You know, like if your opponent's playing Shock, Lightning Strike, Cast Down, pretty much any popular removal spell in the format, Lava Coil, whatever, it's going to kill this regardless, so that first ability almost like doesn't exist a lot of the time. Plus, this provides us a mana sink that allows us to get other creatures, you know, in unblocked. That's great just for the damage, but it's also pretty good in conjunction with Dovin to get more creatures through to put loyalty on him. So, oh, that's awesome, and it's flood protection on top of that. Like, I really like Departed Deckhand, and I've made no secret of that. Also, it doesn't die to Goblin Chainwhirler, so that's pretty sweet. And neither does Night Veil Sprite. Not a delicious new flavor of soda. It's actually a pretty good card, though. This doesn't really provide us card advantage or anything, but it does give us a chance of, like, blasting through lands that we don't need and drawing something better on the next turn. So, even though, again, this doesn't actually provide card advantage, it goes a little bit of the way towards, you know, good card selection, and this deck needs as much of that as it can get. Plus, it's a pretty decent flyer that doesn't die to, you know, Firebrand or Chainwhirler. I think it's a good pick for the deck, but I don't want to play a bunch of copies. That said, there is a 2-drop that dies to both Fanatical Firebrand and Goblin Chainwhirler that I'm still going to play a playset of here, and that's Work-Eyed Marauder. Definitely, you know. Flying creature, going to get through for Dovin a lot of the time, and it'll also just knock other creatures out of the sky when it attacks, allowing you to get multiple dudes in a lot of the time, you know. A lot of decks are only going to have, like, one flyer out, especially this early in the game. You know, you got your mono blue decks and you got your big flyers in the format, but for the most part, usually if you knock one creature out of the sky with a Work-Eyed Marauder, you can get your entire team through. But the deck does get to play some non-creature stuff other than just Dovin. You know, even with 30 slots devoted to creatures, 4 slots devoted to Dovin, we still get 6 slots for spells here, and I think we're using them pretty well, but bear with me on this first one. 3 copies of Lookout's Dispersal. Now, in case you missed it, it's pretty easy to miss. We're running 12 pirates in this deck, so it's fairly simple to be able to have a pirate out and play this for just 2 mana, in which case it's a really good counterspell. But even if you don't have a pirate out, you'll very often play this for 3 mana and kind of feel good about it. But it's not just Chainwhirler. Obviously, this counters all kinds of stuff, you know. If you want to keep your opponent off of Kaya's Wrath on turn 4, this is a great way of doing it. Deafening Clarion, Settle the Wreckage. There are a ton of sweepers that just completely wreck us, but Lookout's Dispersal is a great option against them, all the way until turn like 7 or 8, in which case you've won the game already anyway. Just, I know it looks weird, but a perfect, like, tempo-y kind of addition to the deck that will keep your opponent off of so much. You'd be very thankful that you have this card. Just trust me on this. Try out Lookout's Dispersal. We're not quite done here. We've got a couple of cards that can break the game open depending on the situation. So we're playing 2 copies of Unbreakable Formation and 1 copy of Pride of Conquerors. This was switched, but after doing a lot of messing around, I've decided to switch it back. You know, 2 copies of Unbreakable, because we can use this in a couple of different ways. You know, Pride of Conquerors is really only good in a couple of situations. If you don't have the City's Blessing, this can at the very least answer temporarily a Goblin Chainwhirler to where none of your creatures die. So it can do that in kind of a corner and edge case, but very often we're looking to play this turn 5 or 6 and just finish the game off, knowing that we very well should have the City's Blessing by then. So it's a good card for offensive purposes, and a little bit better for offensive purposes than a card like Unbreakable Formation, but Formation just has incredible defensive potential. It's also great against cards like Kaya's Wrath, Deafening Clarion, again that card, and even things like Cleansing Nova. There are a number of sweepers in the format that this is is very, very good against if you're holding up the mana for it, but it can also be used defensively. If you use this on your main phase, obviously all your dudes get a power boost, which is going to be really important in some combat situations where you have like 7 flyers on board. And when you cast it on your main phase, it also protects you from the crackback, which is really important too. Sometimes this will allow you to get attack steps in that you just have no business being able to get in. If you don't win the game, you'll at least not lose any creatures, and those creatures will be ready to block as well. So you just get this kind of consequence-free attack step in, and that'll break the game wide open even if you don't necessarily win off of it. Now we're playing 20 lands in this thing. We got 14 white sources, 14 blue sources, straight up and down the line because we need untapped mana in both colors on turn 1 as often as possible. And 20 lands doesn't look like a whole lot, but our curve tops out at 5. We got a whole 6 3-drops in the deck if you don't count Lookout's Dispersal. You know, between Dovin and Unbreakable, we really aren't doing anything more than 3 mana, other than Departed Deckhand's ability, but that's really more flood protection. If we do happen to draw a bunch of lands, we can make creatures unblockable. If we don't, that's fine. Most of our stuff is effectively unblockable anyway, so 20 lands is more than enough to get by on. Now here's our sideboard. A lot of self-explanatory stuff in here, but I'll still go through it here because obviously you got to talk about Negate for a second. Great against control decks, obviously, but there's plenty of things you'll put Negate in against, whether it's the Temur Reclamation deck or maybe the Simic Nexus deck if you're not playing on Arena. There's lots of reasons to throw Negate in, whether you're just trying to keep your opponent off of sweepers and spot removal or keeping them off of a big combo. So obviously play Negate. Shouldn't even have to say that. But there's also another copy of Lookout's Dispersal. This was Disdainful Stroke, but it turns out we actually just need another Answer Goblin Chainwhirler, and this will be that in games 2 and 3. But Lookout's Dispersal can obviously help you if you need a 4th copy against, say, Kaya's Wrath, for instance. So this will come in against a fair amount of decks as well. Mentor the Meek is great in slower games or just when you need the card advantage. You know, against Esper decks, this is a great way. So long as you can keep it on board, this is a great way to get extra card advantage out of any creatures you play. And it's good in slow matchups like Sultai as well. Surge Mare is also mostly for the Sultai matchup, but you will put it in for the Gruul match for what that's worth. But mostly, we're playing this against pretty much any deck that runs the Wild Growth Walker package. And it goes pretty well with Dovin, too, for what that analysis is worth. You know, it's yet another creature that against green decks can just get in unblocked, and that helps your Dovin grow. So we'll play that card, but maybe the best card in the entire sideboard is Sky Tether. You know, I was working with a mix of Baffling Ends and Conclave Tribunals, both in the main and the side for a long time. But I've determined that Sky Tether is just Swords to Plowshares in this deck because we're playing nothing but flying and unblockable creatures. So if we can make a creature lose flying and get Defender, basically, then we never have to worry about that creature again, and that's really, really effective against Lyra Dawnbringer, Rekindling Phoenix, a 1-mana answer to Phoenix without ever having to actually kill Phoenix. That's pretty nice, but this does a lot of work too against the mono blue aggro decks. Shut down a Tempest Gen for 1 mana, or maybe they just put, you know, Curious Obsession on a Terramander, something like that. Shut it down for 1 mana. This is a 1 mana answer against a ton of really effective flyers in the format. But here are your power rankings right here. Final score of 60, not super high, but not bad for a deck. It's only like $100 bucks. And you could actually shore down the budget a lot if you take out the dual lands and stuff. Just put in basics or guild gates or whatever. It will bring down the consistency, the power level to speed just a little bit, but you can play this deck for as little as like 50 or 40 bucks, something like that, if you change out the lands. But in its current state, it's actually pretty good in a lot of different matchups, except for the dreaded mono-red matchup. It's not super great in, so I don't know if you want to take it to the arena meta or your F&M, depending on what everyone's playing, but it is pretty good against decks like Sultai, pretty much any deck that these, you know, fast aggro decks in the format have an advantage over right now. Sultai, Esper. This deck is just as good as those decks in some ways against. It's not as tricksy as the tempo-based mono blue deck, and it's not as like raw power as the blue-white aggro deck that people are playing right now, but it still has the ability to race the slower decks, and it has a card advantage engine this time around that it can actually use to get one up on decks that also have card advantage engines. It races other aggro decks pretty well if you play smart with it, but again, you do have to worry about mono red getting that Chainwhirler. And if that's enough to put you off the deck, I totally understand, but in just about every other matchup, you definitely have more than a fair chance of winning, so long as you play smart. Just follow the rules of aggro, you know, make sure you make them have the sweeper and all that. By the way, I'm sorry that the camera base keeps moving. That may be the second time this video. It's actually because the kitten thinks that the most hilarious thing she can play with is the camera base. She has pinpointed that. It's not like I have a crappy cameraman or like a ghost in my house. I just have a cat that's apparently A real stinker and way too smart for how young she is, but in any case, I'm telling you, try this deck out. You probably already have a lot of the pieces for it, but in case you need to pick anything up, just click the first link in the description, go over to TCG Play It, they sponsor you, boy, and then where you're going to get all these cards for the cheapest. So click that link in the description, check out the deck list for yourself, and get anything you need. Aside from that, give me that YouTube stuff. Make sure you like the video. A lot of work went into this one particularly. I've had 3 months or 2.5 months of a season so far here. And I've been messing around with this deck literally the entire time. So a lot of work went into this one. Make sure you like the video. And sub, because not only do we have a couple of decks left in Deck Tech season, but you know what happens after that? Spoiler season. You want to make sure you're front and center for all that. You know, I cover every single spoiler that comes out. So subscribe, hit the bell for the notifications so you get all that information as it rolls in. And if you really want to support the channel and reward all the hard work and know I'm worth it, just throw me $1 a month over on Patreon. I'll leave a link in the description for that. For your $1 a month, I give you some value. I'll let you vote on what decks and videos you want to see, and I'll let you know what's coming up 24 hours in advance. So, you know, try to do something for you. Just throw your boy $1. It's not too much to ask. I know I'm worth it. So, in any case, if you want to do that, you can. Link in the description, as well as numerous links to other content that we've done if you're interested. Lots of stuff down there. Just hit show more and start clicking links like crazy. You're going to land on something good. But aside from that, I guess I'm out of here for this one. So ladies and gentlemen, we'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from the place. Thanks for watching my wizards. I'm messing up the last little bit. How is that possible? I've done this line like 1,000,000 times. Make sure, no matter what you do, that you spread love and you be kind.